Today we're doing 14.4 Day 3 notes, so we are going to choose the correct line of best fit. Well, we know how to find linear, quadratic, and exponential regression in our calculator, but what if we're given a set of data and we're not told what type it is? We need to graph it and figure out what type it is, so that's what we're going to do today. So I'm going to zoom in on this table. Here's our first set of data. We're not told if it's linear, quadratic, or exponential, so we are going to use our calculators to decide that. So let's head over to our graphing calculator. First thing I want you to do is clear the calculator, so that's second plus 7, 1, 2. This just helps reset it so that nothing is on there to mess us up. Well, when we clear it and we're doing stats, the first thing we have to do is go to mode and turn on the stat diagnostics. So we're going to go all the way down until we see stat diagnostics and turn those on. Whenever we work with stats, make sure those are turned on. Alright, I'm going to press clear to get out of that. We want to graph this set of data. So to do that, we need to put it in the stat section. So we're going to go to stat and go to edit to enter our data. So I'm going to take a minute to type in my x's in L1. So there's 1, 2, and 7. Now that we have all of the x's in L1, do the right arrow, go over, and I'll type these in. I'm actually going to use my keyboard. Excuse me. Alright, so now we have our data. Make sure as a visual check that you have the same number in L1 as L2. Well, to graph this, first thing we need to do is go to the stat plot. So we go second, y equals, and we need to turn this plot on. Excuse me, I'm sorry. So I'm going to press enter. It's blinking over on, so I'm going to turn that on. And then it's already on the scatter plot, and that's what we want. So now that we turn the stat plot on, to graph it, we actually go to zoom, and then we want zoom stat, which is 9. Now we can see it. Well, at this point, we have to decide what type of regression we think it is. I don't think it's linear because it has a slight bend. We can check to make sure. But I can't really tell if it's quadratic or exponential. So what I want to do is actually try both of those to see. Again, we don't think it's linear. I'll just show you real quick why linear won't work. So go to stat. To try a certain type of regression, we need to just go down to that regression. So we went to stat, we went over to calc, and now we're going to linreg. Now remember, if we want it to graph that line, we have to store it in the reg EQ. So we do vars, right arrow, enter, enter. Now it says Y1. In order for it to store it, you have to press calculate. So now we press calculate. This gives us the information, which we actually don't need because we don't think it's linear. What we wanted was to store it so that when we graph it, we see this. I graphed the linear regression. This is obviously not linear because it kind of bends upward. So we know it's not going to be linear. Now we need to try quadratic and exponential. So we'll go back to stat, go over to calc. I usually just try quadratic first because I see that one first. So I'm going to go down to quad reg or press 5 and enter. Now again, you have to store the reg EQ. We have to store it so that it will actually graph it. So we press vars, right arrow, enter, enter. And then we have to press calculate. Now at this point, I'm going to go ahead and write it down because if this is the function we want, then we won't have to come back to this screen. So this is our quadratic. We don't know if this is our answer yet, but I'm going to write it just in case. So we know it's going to be y equals, well, we have 3.89, and I'm going to round this 2 up to a 3 because of the 8, x squared, plus 3.75x, and I didn't give myself quite enough room here, minus 5.143. Alright, so again, we aren't sure if that's the answer, but now we're going to go check. So we go to graph, That's looking pretty good. So I right now am thinking this is quadratic because our line goes through almost all of our points. But before I settle on quadratic, I'm going to check exponential just in case. So let's go to Stat, go over to Calc. This time we want to do exponential regression. So we need to go all the way down to 0, the exreg. Press Enter. Again, you have to store it so that it will actually graph it. So we go to vars, right arrow, enter, enter, and go down to calculate. Excuse me. All right, we can write this one down just in case we think it will end up fitting it. So y equals 2.900, and then in parentheses 1.990 to the x. That's the exponential. We already like what we saw for quadratic, but I'm going to write down the exponential just in case it looks a little better. So now we go to graph it. All right, well look at this. This one is clearly not exponential because this barely hits any of the dots and it doesn't have the correct shape. This goes up way too quickly to be exponential. So actually our quadratic function was a better model for this, and therefore this is going to be the line of best fit. All right, so I want you to try that for the next one. I'm going to give you a minute to just put this data in. I want you to try the linear, quadratic, and exponential and figure out what type it is. So pause the video and then come back and do that, and check your work. All right, you should have had time to work on that. So you'll see that I entered my data in here. Now I'm going to go to the y equals, and I'm actually going to start by clearing out the equation that's there. If you don't do that, then when you do the zoom stat, it will actually give you a line. So clear that out. Now our stat plot should still be turned on. So I'm going to go to zoom 9. And here is my data. So again, this is clearly not linear. I'm going to skip linear this time and just check quadratic and exponential. So let's go to Stat, go over to Calc, and down to quadratic because it might be quadratic. Remember, you have to store it so it'll graph it. So go to vars, right arrow, enter, enter, and go down to calculate. I'm going to go ahead and write down the quadratic just so that we don't have to come back to this screen if we end up liking the way the quadratic looks. So y equals 0.33, that 4 is going to round up to a 5, x squared. Then we have minus 17.777x plus 231.657. All right, so now we're going to go to our graph. We graphed a quadratic, but it really is not fitting the data well. It goes up on this side, it's going a little too far on this side, so I don't think quadratic is going to work, but we need to check exponential to make sure that it actually looks better. So let's go to Stat, go over to Calc, and down to exreg for exponential. Of course, we have to store the equation, so vars, right arrow, enter, enter, and then go down to calculate. I'm going to go ahead and write down the exponential, and I'm actually going to put a frowny face beside the quadratic because it did not look good, just so that I can remember. All right, the exponential is going to be y equals 0.013, and then in parentheses 1.227 to the x. Now we need to graph it, and that looks much better. So we see that this line goes through almost all of the points, and it just fits the shape so much better than the quadratic did. So I'm going to mark out the quadratic. That one did not work for this. This one is exponential based on the graphs that we just did in our calculator, and that's going to be our line of best fit. All right, last one I have for you. Again, I want you to try it on your own and then start the video again and check it with me. All right, you can see for the third one I have my data in my calculator. So now let's go to y equals and clear out the equation that's there. Let's go over to zoom 9 and look at it. Well, this one looks pretty clearly linear. So this time I'm actually going to try, go to Stat, go over to Calc. I'm going to try linreg, the linear regression. As usual, we need to store our equation so that it graphs it. So vars, right arrow, enter, enter. Oops, I'm sorry, I pressed plus. Enter. There we go. Enter. Now it's stored it. We have to go to calculate. If you don't press calculate, it will not graph it when you press graph. So calculate. Because we were thinking it was looking linear, I'm going to go ahead and write this one down. So linear, y equals 2.5x plus 4. All right, now let's go graph it. And that looks almost perfect. It is the same shape and it goes through most of the points. So I can say that we can be pretty confident about this. But I actually want to show you something real quick. What if we go to stat and we go over and we do quadreg? Let's just say we weren't sure and we think it might be quadratic. Well, let's go to quadreg and see what happens. We go down, vars, right arrow, enter, enter, go down to calculate. I want you to look at this information we're given, and then we'll look at the graph. So we have A, B, and C. It says that A is 0, which means that if we were to write this down, we would have 0x squared plus, then we have 2.5x plus C is 4. So actually on this one, is this x squared term necessary? No, it's not, because that's a 0. So we actually got the same equation when we did quadratic regression, because the 0, that a value can be 0, and therefore it becomes linear. So then we look at the graph. The graph looks the same as the linear graph because it is linear, but technically it's quadratic if it's a 0. Okay, so I just wanted to show that to you, and that's all we have for this video.